There's a particular kind of silence that comes not from having nothing to say, but from having no one willing to listen. For nearly 4 decades, Betty Broderick lived inside that silence, not the quiet kind, but the kind that builds pressure, the kind that eventually forces its way out. And before she died on May 8th, 2026, at the age of 78, inside the California Institution for Women, she finally said what she had been trying to say for most of her adult life. What she said was not a confession. It was not an apology. It was something far more uncomfortable than either of those things. It was a reckoning. To understand why her final words matter, you have to go back much further than the morning of November 5th, 1989. You have to go back to a young woman named Elizabeth Biseglia, born in New York in 1947, raised in a devout Catholic household, shaped by a world that told women exactly what success was supposed to look like, and who believed, with everything she had, that she was building exactly that. Betty Biseglia was not a passive person. She was sharp, energetic, and deeply ambitious, though her ambitions, like those of most women of her generation, were expected to be channeled through the success of a husband rather than expressed independently. When she met Daniel T. Broderick III at the University of Notre Dame in the late 1960s, she saw in him everything the world had told her to look for: intelligence, drive, a clear blueprint for a successful future, then wanted to become both a doctor and a lawyer. In that era, such ambition was celebrated in a man. Betty celebrated it too, completely, without reservation. What followed was a partnership that was, by any honest measure, built primarily on Betty's labor. She worked multiple jobs while Dan attended Cornell Medical School. She continued working and managing the household while he pursued his law degree at Harvard. She raised their children, 4 of them, through the years of professional training that consumed most of Dan's attention and energy. She built the social infrastructure that a man in his position required. The dinner parties, the friendships with the right families, the image of domestic stability that successful professional men were expected to project. She did all of this not reluctantly, but with genuine investment, because she genuinely believed they were building something together, something that belonged to both of them. By the early 1980s, that investment appeared to have produced exactly what it was supposed to. The Brodericks were living in La Jolla, one of the wealthiest communities in California. Dan was not just a successful attorney. He was one of the most sought-after medical malpractice lawyers in San Diego, earning fees that put him in a financial category most people never approach. They had a large home, country club memberships, private school for the children, and the kind of social standing that takes years to construct. From the outside, the Broderick marriage looked like the American dream, fulfilled on schedule. But Betty would spend the rest of her life telling anyone who would listen that what the outside world saw and what she was experiencing inside that marriage were 2 entirely different things. In 1983, Dan hired a young woman named Linda Colkina as his office assistant. Linda was in her early 20s, attractive, and according to Betty, immediately a source of unease. Betty raised her concerns. Dan dismissed them, not once, but repeatedly, and with a particular kind of dismissiveness that Betty would later describe as part of a broader pattern, a systematic invalidation of her perceptions, her instincts, and ultimately her sense of reality. This is important, because the public narrative of the Broderick case is always centered on the affair as a trigger for everything that followed. Betty found out. Betty couldn't handle it. Betty snapped. That version of events is not entirely false, but it is, according to Betty's own sustained account, radically incomplete. The affair was not the wound. The affair was the point at which a wound that had been deepening for years finally became impossible to ignore. Betty described a marriage in which, despite her foundational contributions, she had progressively less voice and less standing. She described a husband who controlled the finances in ways that left her dependent and uninformed. She described feeling managed rather than partnered, tolerated as a domestic necessity rather than respected as an equal. And she described the years of gaslighting around Linda Colkina as perhaps the most destabilizing element of all, because it taught her that her own perceptions could not be trusted, that raising a legitimate concern would be met not with engagement but with ridicule. Coercive control is a term that domestic violence researchers and advocates began formally defining and documenting in the late 1980s and 1990s. It describes a pattern of behavior in which one partner uses a sustained combination of isolation, manipulation, financial control, and psychological pressure to dominate the other, not through physical violence necessarily, but through the systematic erosion of the other person's independence, confidence, and sense of reality. Betty never used that exact term during the years of her marriage, but the experiences she described, consistently and in detail, across decades of interviews, letters, and statements, map almost precisely onto what researchers now recognize as coercive control. Dan Broderick filed for divorce in 1985. What happened next, Betty maintained until her final days, was not a legal process. It was a campaign. Dan was not simply a party to the divorce proceedings. He was one of the most skilled legal minds in San Diego, with deep professional relationships throughout the court system. He understood how proceedings moved, which levers to pull, and how to use procedural mechanisms to exhaust, frustrate, and financially drain an opposing party. Betty, despite her intelligence, had no comparable expertise. She was navigating a legal process she did not fully understand, against a man who had spent his career mastering exactly that kind of process, and she was doing it while simultaneously processing the collapse of a marriage into which she had poured more than 15 years of her life. The financial dimension of the divorce was, by Betty's account, as damaging as any other element. She described being denied adequate support while Dan controlled the marital assets. She described being left financially unstable in ways that affected her ability to care for herself and maintain any consistent stability for her children. She described a custody arrangement that she experienced not as a negotiated agreement between two parents, but as something imposed on her by a process that systematically favored the party with greater legal sophistication. People who reviewed the public records from the divorce proceedings in later years noted that the financial disputes were far more complex and contentious than media coverage of the case typically acknowledged. The battle over marital assets, support payments, and property was extensive and prolonged. For Betty, these weren't abstract legal matters. They were the difference between stability and chaos, between dignity and humiliation, between having a foundation from which to rebuild and being stripped of everything she had spent 15 years constructing. Her behavior during this period was, by any fair assessment, deeply problematic. She drove her car into Dan's front door. She left profane and threatening messages on his answering machine. She made scenes that embarrassed herself and frightened her children. She was held in contempt of court multiple times. None of this is disputed. Betty herself never disputed it. What she disputed was a narrative that treated these actions as evidence of a fundamental character, rather than as a behavior of a person under sustained, extreme psychological pressure who had exhausted every conventional avenue for relief. Every time she behaved destructively, she said, it was because she had already tried to engage through legitimate channels and had been shut out. She wasn't making excuses. She was describing a dynamic. Whether one accepts her characterization entirely or not, it is worth noting that this dynamic, in which the targeted party in a coercive relationship eventually responds with increasingly desperate and irrational behavior, which then becomes the evidence used to dismiss their claims, is well documented in the literature on psychological abuse. Dan and Linda married in April of 1989. Betty learned about the wedding the same day it occurred. She had not been told in advance. She had not been given the opportunity to prepare herself or to prepare her children. She simply received the information, after the fact, as a notification. 6 months later, on a November morning, she used a key she had to their home, a home that had once been Hayes, to enter their bedroom while they slept. She fired multiple shots. Both Dan and Linda Broderick died. Dan was 44 years old. Linda was 28. Betty Broderick has never denied pulling the trigger. Not once, in 36 years, has she claimed otherwise. What she has always contested is a story that surrounds that fact, the story of who she was, who Dan was, what the years before that morning had actually contained, and what the world was willing to see versus what it preferred to look away from. The first trial, in 1990, ended in a hung jury. 5 jurors voted for first-degree murder. 1 voted for involuntary manslaughter. The remainder could not reach agreement. It was an outcome that reflected, in microcosm, the genuine complexity of the case. The fact that 12 people who heard the same evidence could not arrive at the same conclusion about what Betty Broderick had done and why. The second trial, in 1991, produced conviction. Betty was found guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to 32 years to life in prison. She would be eligible for parole. She would be denied it year after year for more than a decade. The trials made Betty Broderick a household name. 2 television films dramatize a story and were watched by tens of millions of people. She became a cultural reference point, a cautionary tale, depending on your perspective, either about the dangers of obsession and jealousy or about what happens to women when institutions systematically fail them. She was not a simple figure, and the public's fascination with her was never simple either. People who despised her and people who sympathized with her often seemed to be responding to the same set of facts, which says something significant about what those facts actually contained. Betty Broderick's health declined significantly in her final years. By the time of her death in May 2026, she had been on life support and was no longer able to communicate verbally. But she had made sure, in the period before her health collapsed entirely, to leave a written record of what she wanted the world to understand. In a letter addressed to producers working on a documentary project, Betty described her marriage in terms that represented the most formally structured account she had ever given. She used the language of coercive control. She described a sustained pattern of emotional terrorism, her words, that she said had characterized her relationship with Dan Broderick not just during the divorce, but throughout the marriage, during the years when everything appeared, from the outside, to be functioning normally. She described being systematically isolated from information about her own finances. She described having her perceptions repeatedly invalidated, her concerns dismissed, her instincts ridiculed. She described the divorce proceedings as a deliberate weaponization of legal process by someone who knew exactly how to use that process to destroy an opponent, and who chose to use it that way against the mother of his children. She wrote that she had no one to speak for her. Those words, simple as they are, carry the weight of everything that had come before them. She was not referring only to the absence of an advocate in a courtroom. She was referring to the entirety of what the divorce years had meant, the isolation, the powerlessness, the experience of trying to make people understand what was being done to her and finding, repeatedly, that the people with the authority to help simply were not interested in hearing it. She also addressed her parole denials directly. She called herself a political prisoner, not in the sense of someone imprisoned for their beliefs, but in the sense of someone whose continued imprisonment, she argued, had ceased to be about public safety and had become about symbolism. She was, by the time of her final parole hearings, an elderly woman in declining health with no credible threat profile. The argument for continuing to imprison her could not be made on the grounds of danger. It could only be made, she insisted, on the grounds of what releasing her might appear to mean, and that, she argued, was a political calculation, not a just one. The parole board's repeated denials of Betty Broderick were, according to those who observed her hearings, substantially connected to her inability or unwillingness to express what the board considered adequate remorse. This is worth examining carefully, because it gets to something fundamental about how Betty Broderick understood her own situation. She could acknowledge that 2 people were dead because of what she had done. She could acknowledge that her children had suffered immeasurably. She could acknowledge that Linda Kolkina, whatever role she had played in the collapse of the Broderick marriage, had not deserved to die in that bedroom on that morning. Betty never argued that Linda deserved it. What she argued was that Linda's death and Dan's death could not be understood without understanding everything that had preceded them. The problem, from the parole board perspective, was that Betty's framing always circled back to the context. Every expression of acknowledgement came accompanied by the insistence that the context mattered, that to understand what she had done, you had to understand what had been done to her. The board, apparently, heard that insistence as deflection. Betty, apparently, experienced the board's rejection of context as a continuation of the same dynamic she had been living inside for 30 years. The insistence that her account of events was irrelevant, that her experience didn't count, that the only version of events that mattered was the one that left her out. The public record of the Broderick case is extensive. It shows a contentious, prolonged divorce. It shows a woman who behaved, at times, in ways that were threatening, destructive, and harmful to herself and her children. It shows a man who had significant institutional advantages in the legal proceedings. It shows a court system that held Betty in contempt multiple times. It shows attorneys who were repeatedly frustrated by their client's refusal to follow their advice. What the public record does not show, and cannot show, is the interior of a marriage. It cannot show what it felt like to be Betty Broderick in the years before the divorce was filed, in the years when everything looked fine from the outside and something was quietly breaking on the inside. It cannot show the accumulation of small erosions, the dismissed concern, the ridiculed instinct, the financial decision made without consultation, the social humiliation absorbed in silence that Betty described as the actual architecture of what was done to her. Domestic violence advocates who have examined the Broderick case in the years since have increasingly pointed to it as an important, early, and under-examined example of coercive control operating within a high-status marriage. Not to justify the killings, they are careful and consistent on this point, but to argue that the failure to recognize and respond to coercive control is itself a kind of systemic failure, one with consequences that extend beyond the individual cases it touches. Betty Broderick left behind 4 children, none of whom have had an easy relationship with her story or with her. They lost their father and their stepmother in a single morning. They lost their mother to prison for the rest of her life. Whatever their private feelings about what she did and why, those feelings belonged to them. What Betty left for the rest of the world was a case that has never resolved cleanly and probably never will. She was, simultaneously, a perpetrator and someone who described herself as a victim. She was, simultaneously, a person whose destructive behavior was real and documented, and a person whose account of being systematically abused by a more powerful partner was consistent, detailed, and structurally coherent with what researchers now understand about coercive control. She died without parole. She died without formal acknowledgement from any court or institution that her account of a marriage deserved serious consideration. She died